My name's Councillor Anna Rothery. I am elected member for Princes Park Ward. I was elected in 2006. I'm also the mayoral lead for equality and race equality, elected 3 years ago into that position. I'm Lord Mayor of Liverpool. I was elected in 2019. I will be serving 2 consecutive years. This is the first time politically that this has actually happened in the city of Liverpool. Oh, I think, I'd always been quite active within community politics. And so I had, my own struggles and trials in terms of being a young black woman growing up in Liverpool 8, commonly known as Toxteth, now known as Princes Park. And so in terms of, fighting for an education and making sure that other people were able to take advantage of a good education and to sort of try and alleviate some of the disparities in terms of finding education and employment. That was one of the driving forces, and predominantly the lack of black representation within Liverpool politics. It's difficult, shall we say. It's difficult being a black woman in any profession, in any field of work, and just because it's political, it doesn't make it any easier. It's still very challenging, and in Liverpool, when I was elected in 2006, I was the only black Labour councillor for the first 6 years of representing the community. And so, it was a very difficult position to be in. It was quite a lonely place because obviously I was pushing the equality agenda, race equality, and also pushing the agenda around, true representation of diverse communities within Liverpool. I'm one of the most fortunate councillors, really, because I actually got to represent the community that I grew up in Liverpool 8, so I'm passionate about my community. Liverpool has one of the oldest black communities in the whole of Europe, spanning almost 400 years. And the large majority of diverse communities are located in the Liverpool 8 area. And so growing up in that ward, I had a great insight into what the challenges were and, the impacts of, failure in terms of education and employment, etc. So, I'm in a very privileged position to represent a community that I know like the back of my hand. And so in terms of understanding what the problems are on a strategic level, but also on a very personal level, I have a really good, strong network within the area I represent in terms of community activists, community leaders. And that's where I take my direction from. I always check in to make sure that I've got the message right, because the message changes year on year. So, having the ability to go back into the fold of the community and have conversations with people, I think it's crucial to being a really strong advocate and a good representative. Well, it just, for me, it's like last in, first out. And there's no denying that, in terms of COVID and staving it off, we are on the front line as black people. It's part of our culture to be caring and sharing and, to work alongside our, communities, etc. in times of crisis. And, there's no difference between black and white on that level. But in terms of understanding our cultural diversity and making sure that our elders are cared for in the appropriate way, and people who suffer from underlying illnesses like sickle cell, for instance, there's more of a propensity to, have COVID, and for it to be quite serious with underlying illnesses that are really illnesses like lupus, sickle cell, predominantly black communities that suffer from those. So obviously there's going to be issues around that. But also I think in terms of frontline staff, you look in any hospital at the forefront of everything that's going on, and there's been huge deaths in terms of the NHS. It's staff who are on the front line. And so we have to take into account that. But, there's also the issues around, how we look after ourselves in terms of our pay scale, etc. Are we looking after ourselves as well as we should be in terms of preparing and being healthy enough to stave off COVID, and the impact that has on us, on our, not just our physical well-being, but our mental health and well-being as well. And so there are many things that contribute to Black people suffering disproportionately from COVID. But they are not things that, they are things that could be avoided with the right support and systems being put in place. And so that flags up another issue around systemic racism and how that impacts on Black people right across the board, from profession to profession. But we're seeing it more so now. And it's probably being highlighted more now because of COVID, because, it's under scrutiny. The world's eye is looking at COVID and its impacts. And so, we will see that disparity in terms of, those who are succumbing to the pandemic. Well, for me, 2020 is a pivotal time in history in terms of equality and race relations. And that's because a number of factors. Obviously, we've had the rise of the BLM movement, which is now mainstream. It's no longer a fringe group fighting for, human rights. It's a mainstream group with many allies from many diverse backgrounds. And then if you sort of put that in line with COVID and the impact that that's had on people in terms of, people are working from home, there's less socialising going on. We have a lot of time to sit and, think about, the great threats to society globally, not just here in the UK. And I think that's really enabled people to tap into their emotional intelligence and start looking at, the real things in society. And one of those real things is racism and how it impacts on Black people. And so I think prior to COVID, racism was, there would be incidents, George Floyd is not the first Black man to be murdered, in the US or the UK or globally. But, what happened there is that normally people would say this is awful, this is a terrible thing that's happened, and then it move on to the next thing. Without anybody really tackling or challenging why this is still allowed to happen in a modern society. And so I think because of COVID, there's been more time to unpick racism and the impact of racism on individuals and on their lives and that of their families. And so, it initiated a very big global conversation about, is there a place for racism in a modern society? That is the big question that everybody's pondering. And it seems to be a collective response is that no, there is no place for racism in a modern society because it's a completely outmoded concept. And so when we look at, the street names and the statues and decolonising, that is an integral part of doing away with this outmoded sort of backward train of thought. But we also need to look to the future and start looking at how do we reshape society, a society where racism plays no part. And so it's very, very crucial that we start laying the foundations for that and putting strong, robust frameworks in place in terms of change in culture and psyche and doing away with the systemic racism that's handed down from person to person and all of the things like nepotism in terms of recruitment, etc. And how do we take our rightful place going forward? There will be massive changes beyond COVID that would never have taken place if it hadn't been, this alignment of tragedies, really. But, those tragedies that have come together have been able to give us that headspace to start having important conversations about not just about racism per se, but what a world without racism would actually look like. Well, I've just started to work quite closely with Cheshire NHS, the Black Midwifery programme. And, I'm really pleased to see the response from the NHS on this, because they've appointed, leads on the initiative from the Black community who are aware. And I can't stress enough, knowledge and understanding of a particular community is integral in terms of delivery. And so going back to what I was saying earlier about knowing the community I represent, knowing the community that you're offering services to and understanding what the issues are. I mean, let's be, if we were completely frank and honest about things, we know that as Black people, we don't receive the same service as our white counterparts. We know that. It's a given. That's not up for debate. We know that. We know that in terms, it doesn't matter what the service is, it's inadequate when it comes to Black people, and it's not of the same calibre as offered to other people. So I'm not surprised that we have, more deaths. I'm horrified at it, but I'm not surprised that we have more deaths of Black women in childbirth. And so, we need to use once again, our Black professionals. We often see with initiatives that, somebody will, take to the helm and say, we're going to do a piece of research to understand why this happens. And then at the head of what they're doing, they put, white members of staff at the helm trying to push it through and drive it forward. And for me, that's a complete failure. And we've seen this historically. We've seen this happen over and over again. And we've seen it fail over and over again, because you have to have that connection, number one, to be able to, instigate these open conversations with the people that are using the service. And then you also have to have the understanding in terms of what some of the issues are in terms of, just accessing the provision. We know within our communities that, it's difficult to get people to access the service, especially around health services, because, I've had a terrible experience as a woman with women's issues for myself trying to access services. And, it was absolutely horrendous. And it was another woman, it was another woman who was doing the consultation. And she just sat on her mobile phone throughout the consultation. And she did not even give me the most basic of respect of looking me in the eye and doing a consultation with me. And so, we understand what happens. But, in order to break through that and speak to our service providers, and, it's their duty. We're not asking for any favours. There's a duty of care to make sure that all of the provision is delivered consistently across the board to everybody, and everybody's able to access that. So I'm really pleased to be working with the Black midwives. And, they're doing some really interesting stuff around, Black women and breastfeeding, understanding, the early years in terms of children, and how we weave into that, that cultural knowledge around the diverse background of our Black women. And also I think a crucial thing is that we're often, grouped together as a homogenous group because we're all Black. People don't understand that. Within that, we're made up of many different people with many different values and attitudes, etc. And so if you don't understand that, then how can you possibly create a provision or a service that, works for everybody? So I think it's really crucial that we have Black leadership on the initiatives. And, and I'm pleased to see that people are starting to recognise that. And I constantly reinforce that, when I'm speaking to anybody, not just NHS but anybody, I reinforce the importance of having Black leadership. And that's a difficult conversation, because you're not saying, the person at the helm in charge of it is any less of a person or less professional or less qualified. You're not saying that. What you're saying is, if you are really committed, to eradicating racism and discrimination, then you must recognise that in certain issues we have the edge, and you should be utilising that. I think more Black people should come into politics because it's absolutely crucial. In terms of what we're doing in the city in Liverpool now, it's not just about local authorities. I mean, we've got Mayor Anderson, who's made a commitment to the Race Equality Task Force, but we can't do that alone. We have to work with our partners on these initiatives. But more importantly, we need to have representation, political representation from the black community, from all our diverse communities. We've got a large, very large Chinese community in Liverpool, never come forward to stand as political representatives. That's changed this year. This year we brought Operation Black Vote back to Liverpool, and I'm really proud to say that as part of the cohort we have Chinese representation. And that's been difficult. That's something that I've been trying to, encourage for many years, and just could not get anybody to come forward and do it. But, in terms of being that representative, you have that voice. You're part of the decision-making process. You're there to educate people who know nothing about diverse communities on, how we function, what our wants, needs and aspirations are. How often do we see, as an example, for instance, access and education at school? We see parents putting down their first choice, and constantly they don't get that seat in that school. They may go through an appeals process and they get nowhere with the appeals process either. And then I'm not surprised because, this goes on because there's nobody on that school board of governors from diverse communities educating the other governors about how we educate an entire city. Not just not just one section, but a cross-section of the people who are made up in that. And so we do need to have strong representation because we still need to be raising the issues. And, I'm a firm believer it's not one at a time. It's one after another. We need, full representation. I think now in Liverpool we've got 6 councillors from diverse communities. In 2020, that is absolutely appalling. I'm striving to triple that. We've got a black MP. Kim Johnson is our black MP, and obviously I'm the first black Lord Mayor. But in 2020, when you look at a city that's built on, one of the oldest black communities in the whole of Europe, then, why have we only got such a small number of people representing such a large part of our community? We've got over 50 languages spoken in Liverpool. And so, we've got our Somali community, we've got West African community, we've got, where are their voices? For people to say, oh, well, we've got 5 black councillors, that's enough. That is only like tinkering on the edges of the diverse communities within that cohort of a black community. And so I can speak about Liverpool-born black people and our wants and needs and aspirations because I come from that sort of background. I have knowledge about other communities because I grew up in a very diverse community. But am I the right person to be speaking out about what a Somali woman may need or a Yemeni woman may need? No. So we need that representation and we need a commitment to it. Well, celebrating Black History Month is very important because it gives us the opportunity to stop and look at what's actually bubbling under the surface for the rest of the year in terms of what we do as black community. But for me, it doesn't really carry much weight for me, Black History Month, because it's just 1 month. And it's seen as one of those things, it's Black History Month again. We have to do what we do at Black History Month. And so, for me, it should be 365 days of the year. To highlight all the amazing stuff that goes on in the black community in 1 month. And then as soon as we get into November, it's all forgotten about for another 12 months. Does not make any sense to me. We need to build on that. Some of the initiatives that I'm launching, I've deliberately chosen not to launch in October during Black History Month. And so I'll be launching them in November because my commitment is that, Black history should be on the agenda 365 days a year. And the commitment should be there from our partners who come knocking on the door, just before October and saying, right, guys, what can we do together? I want to see a stronger commitment across the whole of the year from those partners and a real commitment to making some really positive change as we go forward.